Thanks, guys. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm excited to be presenting with my colleagues. My name is Peter Franz. I'm a second-year graduate student in the Clinical Science PhD program at Harvard University. And tonight, along with my colleagues and friends Kathryn Fox and Erik Nook, we'll be talking a little bit about understanding suicide risk. And in particular, we're going to be discussing the role of language, emotion, and pain, and how these concepts influence self-harm. So, we know that suicide is kind of a perplexing phenomenon. Perhaps more than any other motivation, humans are driven for self-preservation. Yet, taking one's life is an age-old phenomenon. It's present across cultures, and it's been present for most of recorded history. Despite how long it's been around and how long it's been considered a societal problem, we continue to know very little about suicide and why it occurs. However, research from our group and others like it around the world have recently started to begin looking at data to help us chip away at this difficult problem. So tonight, what we're going to be talking to you is about that research that our lab and others like it have been doing. So just to give you a quick overview of how this is going to go, I'm going to give an introduction of suicide, talk a little bit about some of the terms, some of the demographic variables, just to orient you to some of these kinds of concepts that we're going to be discussing for the rest of the evening. Then Kathryn will talk about emotion regulation and non-suicidal self-injury. And finally, Erik will talk about alternative emotion regulation strategies to self-harm. But first, I'd like to introduce Phillip. Phillip was a 24-year-old man living in a rural area in the northeast United States. 9 months before his death, Phillip lost his job at a small manufacturing facility. After that, he felt trapped living in the small town where he grew up, and he started to abuse alcohol, and not just out at parties with friends, but sometimes also alone to try and make himself feel better. One night in October of 2012, after briefly meeting up with some of his high school friends, he went home alone. He parked his car in his driveway, and he took his life with his father's gun. Phillip left behind 2 older brothers. Both of his brothers knew that Phillip at times had struggled with depression, and that he'd even cut himself on occasion while he was growing up. Nonetheless, the news of Phillip's death came as a shock and was an incredible surprise to his brothers. But despite this incredible tragedy of Phillip and his story, our lab and the labs like ours around the world are dedicated to understanding this tremendous problem and relieving it for those who suffer from it and those who are impacted by it every single year. And so tonight, what we're going to focus on is the upside of this, the positives, the research that we understand, and how we're starting to prevent this terribly destructive behavior. So first, what I'll talk about is the prevalence and cost of suicide. Then, I'll discuss some suicide demographics, giving you a sense of who it is who's at risk for suicide. Next, I'll discuss some definitions and terms that we'll be using throughout the remainder of the talk. Then, I'll introduce you to some of the ways that we study suicide as a scientific discipline in labs like ours. And finally, I'll end with a few questions and answers from the audience. So what we see here are the top 5 causes of death in the United States today. And if you're willing, I'd like to ask, who thinks that cancer is the #1 cause of death in the United States? Please go ahead and just raise your hand if you like. Okay. Who thinks that it's unintentional injury? This would be things like accidental drownings, accidental firearm discharge, motor vehicle accidents, etc. Okay. Who thinks it's homicide as the #1 killer of people in the United States? What about heart disease? And finally, who thinks suicide is the #1 cause of death in the United States? Okay. So today, suicide is a problem that affects millions of families in America. For those who are ages 10 to 34, it is the 2nd leading cause of death. For those ages 35 to 54, it is the 4th leading cause of death. And of all the deaths due to the top 5 causes in the United States, suicide accounts for approximately 13% of these deaths. And as my advisor has noted, this means that someone is more likely to die by his or her own hand than by that of someone else. So, I alluded to this, but each year, just over 40,000 Americans die by suicide. And to give you a sense on the perspective of this problem, that's more than double the capacity of Boston's TD Garden. But in addition to the emotional loss that suicide is associated with, there's also an economic burden, which falls most heavily on adults of working age. So what this figure shows is the medical and work-related costs of suicide in the United States based on death by intent, including suicide, in the United States in 2013. What we see is that suicide in 2013 accounted for $50.8 billion, and that's about 24% of the total fatal injury cost in the US. So, next, what I'd like to talk to you a little bit about, as I mentioned earlier, is who is at risk for suicide. So, we know that suicide differs between different ethnic groups. And what we're seeing here is a graph on the y-axis showing suicide rate per 100,000 people. And the blue bars represent 4 separate ethnic groups. What we find at about 14.7 deaths per 100,000 due to suicide is that American Indian and Alaskan Native Americans are about the highest ethnic group in terms of suicide risk. And they're followed not far behind by white Americans at 12.6 suicides per 100,000 individuals. We also know that age is a relevant factor when considering suicide risk. What we see here is the same kind of graph, but instead of ethnic group on the x-axis, we're actually looking at age groups. And so what we see is that the rate drastically increases from 10 up through the adolescent years to about 20 to 24. That's the same age that Phillip was in the story that I talked about before. After this, suicide rate sort of tapers off a bit, but then continues to rise up until ages 50 to 54, who in America represent the highest statistical group in terms of likelihood for dying by suicide. Next, this graph shows geography-based suicide rates, looking state by state. And in darker colors, we see states with higher suicide rates, and in lighter colors, states with lower suicide rates. And what this map shows is that Wyoming, Alaska, and Montana are the states with the 3 highest suicide rates in the US, while Massachusetts, New Jersey, and New York State are the 3 lowest. And remember that I told you, Phillip was from a rural area. And we see, based on this map, the areas with smaller population densities tend to have higher suicide rates. So it's an important factor to consider in terms of suicide risk. We also know that gender is a relevant factor, that suicide is not equal between males and females. And on the y-axis here, we're looking at odds ratio, representing the relative likelihood that one would engage in a suicidal behavior. And what we see is males in blue are about 3.5 times as likely than females in red to take their own life. But interestingly, we also see that females are about 3 times more likely than males to attempt suicide. And in addition, females are also more likely to think about suicide even without acting. So with that in mind, the next thing I'd like to jump into is a review of some of the terms that encompass the behaviors that we know to be relevant to suicide research. So, first, and perhaps foremost, and most obviously maybe, is suicide death. Suicide death is death caused by direct, self-directed, injurious behavior with the intent to die. When most people, including psychologists, think about suicide or discuss it in their research, this is often what they mean. But we also know that there are other behaviors relevant to suicide and suicide risk. One of these is suicide attempt. And of course, this may be sort of obvious, but suicide attempt is a non-fatal, deliberate, self-directed act with the intent to die as the result. Next, we have suicide ideation, which includes thoughts about suicide or killing oneself. And finally, non-suicidal self-injury, which are self-directed, injurious acts with no intent to die as a result. This would include things like cutting or burning oneself. And for reference, these will be some of the topics discussed by Kathryn in particular, but also Erik in the presentations that follow mine. But together, these behaviors are termed self-injurious thoughts and behaviors, and they represent the #1 risk factor for suicide. And so it should be obvious that these are the things we should be focusing on if what we want to do is gain some predictive power to better predict suicide in the real world. So next, what I'll talk a little bit about is how our lab and others study suicide. And just to remind you, I've already told you a little bit about who is at risk for suicide, but why would people engage in self-injurious behavior intentionally? It's a tricky question, and it's one that has perplexed researchers for decades, as I mentioned. But recent advances in the ways that we study suicide have started to shed some light about why people might engage in this. So tonight, and right now, I guess, what I'll show you is some of the ways that we do this in our lab. Well, first, I think it's important to mention, for decades, the primary way we've studied suicide is through self-report. And self-report would be reporting by yourself to a researcher about your own engagement in the behavior, either in the past or present, or also reporting on your own estimation of your future likelihood to continue engaging these kinds of behaviors. And to be clear, self-report has provided a ton of clarity in terms of better understanding suicide and suicide risk. But there are some newer methods, in particular ones that we've been using in our lab, that when combined with self-report have shown incredibly powerful results for indicating suicide risk through things like suicidal thinking. So first, what I'd like to show you is a task that we developed in our lab at Harvard to measure suicidal thinking. If you're willing, I'd love to try this together. What you're going to see is a small cross appear on the middle of the screen. This is just to focus your attention in the middle so you're ready for what's coming up. After that, you're going to see a word. If you're willing, what I'd like you to do is simply shout out the color of that word, and it will either be red or blue. Are you ready? Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, these are skipping straight through. Well, so what those showed, what I just showed, or I tried to show, and I'm sorry for the PowerPoint mishap, really was that we would see a word and then you shout out the color of it and then move on to another word, and we go through a series of words like this. But importantly, the words, if you saw that last very brief slide, the words that I showed you were based in two separate categories. Half of the words were suicidal in nature, and the other half were negative but non-suicidal. And so this is important because what we're doing is comparing your response time between one type of word and the other. And in this context, response time indicates the amount of interference the meaning of that word holds on your thoughts. So greater response time indicates greater interference. And this is important because it allows us to make some predictions about what types of people might score differently on this test. So what I'd like to do next is simply show you the results from this experiment. And just to backtrack and give you a sense for how this experiment came about, the researchers from our lab, Dr. Christine Cha and Dr. Matt Nock, went to a psychiatric inpatient unit here in the Boston area. They asked people who were in the inpatient unit if they would answer some questions and complete a brief task. Importantly, about half of these individuals were in this inpatient unit because they had made a suicide attempt. The other half had not. And what I'll show you is the data for these two groups based on the different types of words and their response delay for them. So first, what we see is that for negative words, the attempters in green are much higher than the non-attempters in blue, meaning they got caught up in the meaning of these negative non-suicide related words. And I guess that's not surprising. But this next result, I think, is particularly interesting. We're seeing a gigantic difference in terms of the response time between suicide attempters and non-suicide attempters for suicide-related words, indicating quite clearly that these individuals may be getting especially trapped or caught up in the meaning of suicide-related words, and that this differs between those who are attempters and those who are non-attempters. On its own, these results are interesting, but don't actually reveal all that much about real-world suicidal behavior. But the researchers who wrote this study followed up every single individual who was part of the original research project 6 months later. Sadly, during that 6-month window, some portion of these individuals did go on to make a suicide attempt. But it turns out that delay that we can measure using the task that I just showed you predicted who it was among this group who would go on to then make a suicide attempt. But importantly, this predictive ability exceeded that of other common clinical measures that we would use typically to assess an individual's risk of engaging in suicidal behavior, including suicide attempts. And this includes depression scores from the individuals, the report by the emergency room physician of how likely he thought that individual was to go on to make a suicide attempt. And you've seen this concept already. The results based on that task also predicted whether someone would go on to make a suicide attempt above and beyond that individual's own self-report of their risk. So what we're seeing here is that a very simple behavioral task that's easy to employ in a number of settings, including an emergency room, is capable of identifying real-world suicide risk over a relatively long period. And the truth is that this is the kind of thing that's been lacking in suicide research and suicide prevention for decades. So it's really an exciting advance in terms of our scientific ability to get some traction on this behavior and maybe start preventing it. So in summary, what I talked about tonight was a little bit of the cost, both emotionally and financially, of suicide in America. I also discussed demographic risk factors, giving you a sense of who it is who is most at risk for suicide. Then I outlined several self-injurious thoughts and behaviors, giving you definitions and hopefully giving you some clarity about these terms that are relevant to real-world suicide risk. I also talked about the science of suicide, giving you actually a great preview into some interesting and powerful results that our lab found a few years ago, looking at how to prevent the suicide problem in a serious way. So next up, what we're going to have is a discussion by Kathryn about emotion regulation and why that is relevant to some of these topics, especially non-suicidal self-injury. But before we switch over, I would love to pause, thank you, and take any questions that you may have. Please.
So, because we missed a few of the slides, could you give us some examples of negative words versus suicide-related words and what differences and how they might overlap?
Sure. So the question is, you messed up on some of the slides and you missed the words that I wanted to present to you, and I'm sorry about that. But what were the differences between these words, and why is that important for the study of suicide? So the words that we were looking at were words with negative content. These are things like scared or ashamed. So they're intensely emotion-related words that have a seriously negative connotation for individuals. And the other words were death and suicide. And so the reason we chose those negative words as a comparison group is to try to take into account the negative content of the suicide-related words. So imagine if the control words were computer or chair. And we compared your reaction time to those words relative to suicide words. We would expect that everyone would show a delay in the suicide words. This would differentiate almost nothing in terms of groups and suicide risk. But when we control for the negative connotation, the negative meaning in these words, then we can start to get a little bit at what's unique about suicide words in terms of their meaning to specific individuals. Please.
Is this test readily used by schools and things?
So the question is whether this test is readily used by schools or other institutions to detect suicide risk. It's not. It's a great question, though. We'd love to be able to employ this kind of test to say, this person is at especially heightened risk and should be hospitalized, or we should take care of this person, or we should intervene in some way. The problem is that despite the amount of risk that we know based on general risk factors, and combining those general risk factors with the predictive ability of this test, ultimately, the best prediction about any given individual's suicide likelihood is that they won't do it. And the reason for this is that it's an incredibly low base rate behavior. Remember back to the demographic slides that I showed at the beginning. These slides were looking at percent, but not per 100, but per 100,000. We are looking at a very different scale in terms of behavior. And so unfortunately, using this test to predict an individual's suicide risk is not particularly accurate. However, it can differentiate groups of people by taking into account averages in the statistical programming that we use to get our results.
And again, do schools do this so they can find out whether they're...
At present, no schools are doing this actively with individuals that we know of. As I did mention, it is a readily employable task, although it might present some problems, I think, for schools or people using it because the results, although important and somewhat accurate, are still predicting a very low base rate behavior.
So I know you were speaking a little bit about the demographics and everything. I know you mentioned that men have a higher risk of actually committing suicide, but then women have a higher risk of thinking about it and attempting it.
Yeah.
And I just wanted some clarity of like why it's like that.
Sure. So this is a great question. The question is that earlier we saw that there are gender differences between males and females in terms of suicide risk. But I mentioned males are more likely to die by suicide, while females are more likely to attempt suicide. We do have some data that I think can shed some light in terms of answering this question. Overall, we know that suicide method differs between the genders. Here what we're seeing is suicide methods broken up by different colors. On top we have other, which includes a broad category of behaviors, suffocation in light blue, poisoning in dark blue, and then at the bottom firearm use. And then what we see here are percent of females and percent of males engaging in each of those types of behaviors. So what we see here is that by far the most likely method of suicide for females is poisoning, while the most likely method for males is firearm use. And if you think about that, if you think about the lethality of these methods, using a gun is a far more lethal means of achieving suicide than would something like using pills. Pills allow for the option for intervention, that if you take a bunch of pills with the intent to end your life, there may be still some time for someone to intervene in one way or another by calling an ambulance, for example. But after someone has used a gun on his or herself, it's more difficult to intervene, and that results in far more deaths overall, unfortunately. Sure. Yep. Sorry.
Does suicide always start with suicidal ideation or thoughts?
It's an important question, and it's something that people in our field debate about constantly. So, I'm sorry, the question is, does suicide, the act of a suicide attempt or another type of suicidal behavior, is it always preceded by suicide ideation, thoughts of suicide? So, some might argue that it's hard to engage in any type of deliberate act without in some sense thinking about it beforehand. However, many argue that there is such a thing as impulsive suicides. So it's something that's sort of up for debate, but a really relevant construct for us to consider, whether individuals really are thinking about this before they act, or do some people do it without thinking at all. And there are data to support both options, actually. So thank you. And one more, go ahead.
How did you calculate the financial impact of the various self-imposed
Sure.
methods?
I didn't, but the CDC looked at the question that was asked is about calculating the financial cost of suicide based on the graph that I showed very early in my presentation. The answer is, what they are looking at are a number of factors. One big one is number of years lost. So if we consider an individual's, or across our population, average life expectancy, and then look at the age at which an individual dies by suicide, we can factor in what the amount of money contributed to their own life and society we lose by virtue of not having that individual in the workforce. But there are other metrics that are important here too. One big one is the fact that ambulances, medical staff, etc., these cost a considerable amount of money. And when you consider the fact that 40,000 plus individuals are engaging in the behavior annually, then those kinds of care-related costs also come into play as well. So thank you very much. I appreciate you all listening, and I'll turn things over to Kathryn. Yeah.
If I unplugged you or just like show them?
Doesn't matter. My side does. I cut out the ones that are a little weird, so you can just hold through these data. I think you're fine.
Yeah, you're fine. This one's weird. Wait, I think what I'm doing is making things go forward. I'm confused. I tried to press just the space.
Yeah, that worked. Space worked.
It did?
Yeah, because I was clicking the notes.
Oh, okay. Okay. Hi, my name is Kathryn Fox, and I'm a fourth-year graduate student in the clinical psychology program here at Harvard. And so before I jump into this part of the talk today, I quickly want to recap what Pete was talking about before. So as you might have already known or expected, suicide is a big problem that has immense personal and economic costs. In fact, likely many of you here have been touched by suicide at some point in your life. And in addition to suicide, there are several additional self-injurious behaviors that are related to suicide. And I'm going to be talking about one of those behaviors today, non-suicidal self-injury. So Pete told you that non-suicidal self-injury is defined as intentionally hurting yourself without wanting to die. And I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about what we're talking about when we refer to self-injury. So non-suicidal self-injury is considered moderate. It includes things like cutting your skin to the point of drawing blood, hitting your skin till you bruise, those types of behaviors that do have a lasting mark. It doesn't include things like picking at wounds, biting at skin or nails, or those types of things that you see much more commonly across people. And it also doesn't include socially sanctioned behaviors like tattooing, piercing, those types of things. So you might be surprised to know, or at least I was surprised to learn, that non-suicidal self-injury is really quite prevalent in the United States. About 5.5% of adults and 17% of teens report engaging in these behaviors at some point in their life. Among people seeking intensive psychiatric care, these numbers are even higher, potentially reaching up to 50%, according to some research. In addition to being dangerous in their own right, non-suicidal behaviors are associated with numerous negative outcomes, most notably future suicide attempts. And so during the talk today, I want to focus on two things. First, I want to talk about why non-suicidal self-injury might be related to suicide. And next, I want to talk about why people engage in non-suicidal self-injury to begin with. So a few different theories have been proposed linking non-suicidal and suicidal behaviors, and probably one of the most common of these is that there might be things increasing risk for both of these different types of behaviors. So if you think back to Phillip, we know that growing up he had been depressed, and later he went on to cut himself, a form of non-suicidal self-injury, and later to take his life. So it could be things that mental illnesses like those listed here predispose people to both of these types of behaviors. And consistent with that idea, the majority of people who do engage in these self-injurious behaviors do have histories of these types of mental illnesses. But what's tricky here is that the majority of people with mental illness and even severe mental illness never go on to engage in either form of self-injury. So it's probably not the whole story. There are likely other things going on. And one of the possible things that could be going on is that some people are just born with an inherently lowered fear of things like pain, blood, knives and razors, or even a fear of death. So in the case of Phillip, you could imagine that in the face of distress, when he heard about the possibility of using non-suicidal self-injury to feel better, it might have been easier for him if he was less fearful of knives and blood than for somebody who's very fearful of those things. Similarly, it might be easier for somebody who's less fearful of the idea of dying to take their life. However, what I haven't yet told you is that non-suicidal self-injury onsets far before suicidal behaviors at about 13 years of age, which is 4 or 5 years before most people start engaging in suicidal behaviors. So another possibility is that non-suicidal self-injury actually acts as a bridge for engaging in suicidal behaviors in the future. And to make this more clear, it could be that choosing to self-harm without wanting to die, Phillip choosing to cut himself, might have habituated him to things like pain, blood, knives, and even the idea of being somebody who self-harms. When I say habituated, I mean just gets him used to, becomes less fearful because he's now had experience with it and probably become less scared of it. Another possibility that I find particularly interesting is the possibility of some amount of conditioning going on. And just in case you guys aren't familiar with Pavlovian conditioning, I want to give a brief primer. So imagine somebody says that they're going to get you your favorite dessert. For me, right now, that's probably ice cream, but if you ask me next week, it might be something different. As soon as the ice cream is put in front of me, or even just talking about it now, I notice that my mouth will begin to salivate as I think about eating the ice cream, because I love ice cream. And now imagine the next 100 times I ate ice cream, so within the next month, I first heard a bell ring, and then I was given the ice cream. And so over and over again, I hear bell, given ice cream, salivate. Bell, ice cream, salivate. Eventually, just the bell on its own would lead me to salivate, because now I'm going to associate that bell with the ice cream. Is that making sense to people? Okay. So you're probably wondering why this might be related to non-suicidal self-injury. And what we know from a lot of research is that the majority of people who engage in these types of behaviors, cutting and burning, say that doing so actually helps them to feel better. It helps them to regulate their emotions. And so you can imagine that to engage in non-suicidal self-injury, back up. In fact, even participants from my study have told me that self-harm is almost like an addiction for them, and they have no desire to stop because it does help them. One participant even told me, I have a strong urge, a desire, and almost need to cut. The feeling I get is such a relief and better than almost anything else I can think of. So now bringing this back to Pavlovian conditioning, you know that to engage in non-suicidal self-injury, you would have to be exposing yourself to things like knives, razors, blood, even exposing yourself to the idea of yourself as somebody who self-harms. And if you're repeatedly pairing that with the feeling better, over time, all of those things on their own will start to be associated with feeling better as well. So maybe over time, people are becoming less fearful of these types of things because of this conditioning process that's going on, which thereby predisposes them to choose trying to hurt themselves to end their life in the future because maybe they're less fearful of those things or even feel more positively about those things over time. So what I'm hoping you are all wondering now is why non-suicidal self-injury could make people feel better. And to most of you here, my guess is that that sounds very counterintuitive. Most of us try to avoid pain at all costs and probably can't even imagine choosing to self-harm. And so that's what I want to focus on next. Why do people engage in non-suicidal self-injury? Which I think can be better understood in terms of the question, why does non-suicidal self-injury make people feel better? And I'm specifically going to be focusing on 3 different models that explains why non-suicidal self-injury make people feel better. And those are pain offset relief, distraction, and self-punishment. So first, to tell you a little bit about pain offset relief. This is specifically referring to when pain is removed. So once the knife is removed from the skin, that type of thing. And there's actually a large body of research across people who do and don't engage in non-suicidal self-injury that shows that we all feel better at the removal of pain. And you might be able to think of some evolutionary reasons why that might be the case. But what I find particularly interesting is that you even see this in other species. And we can talk about the different ways that you can see this in different groups as well. So we know that pain offset relief makes people feel better, so the removal of pain. But there are 2 other models as well that kind of focus on that during pain component. Like, what about pain could help people to feel better? And one of those is the idea of distraction. So people who engage in non-suicidal self-injury tend to have very negative emotions. And it could be that choosing to cut or burn helps take their attention away from those emotions and towards something else, improving their mood by shifting attention. So for example, I know before giving his talk today, Pete was really nervous. He was thinking about how he would probably be talking too fast and nobody would understand what he was saying. If a dog had walked into the room, that likely would have helped him shift his thoughts from being in his head about how he might mess up to the distracting dog, improving his mood just by focusing attention on something new. But the issue with non-suicidal self-injury, where it might be different, is that people engaging in these behaviors tend to have more negative emotions than people who don't, and the negative moods are they seem a little bit stickier if you talk to them about it. So people who propose the distraction model say, hey, typical distractors probably won't work. Pain, which is a really intense distractor, is necessary for people who are engaging these behaviors to shift their mood and to feel better. And the last model I'm going to talk about is the self-punishment model. And rather than focusing on negative mood more generally, this focuses specifically on self-criticism. And I'm bringing self-criticism into the picture because there's a lot of research linking non-suicidal self-injury and self-criticism. For example, people who engage in non-suicidal self-injury tend to have higher levels of self-criticism than those who don't. And we also see that self-criticism actually predicts how long somebody's willing to endure pain, using something over there that I'll talk about in a little bit. Finally, there's some research to suggest that self-criticism actually predicts future engagement in non-suicidal self-injury. So together, this paints the picture of why we're now focusing on self-criticism. And the self-punishment model brings in the fact that the majority of people who are highly self-critical and engaging in non-suicidal self-injury say that they do it in part to improve their mood and in part to self-punish. So the idea here is that maybe for highly self-critical people, the pain that they're feeling is felt as deserved, and that then helps them to feel better. So what I'm going to talk about now is a research study that we did in my lab that tried to look at each of these different models as ways that people who engage in non-suicidal self-injury might feel better. And the main question we were asking is, what improves mood in people who engage in non-suicidal self-injury? And before doing the study, we had a few different thoughts. First, we thought that non-painful distraction would result in small changes in mood. And this is a little bit different from what some of the researchers who hypothesized that model would say. But we've seen that distraction can work for people with other types of mental illnesses. So we thought it might work here as well, but on a small scale. We also thought that pain would improve mood for all of our participants, and that this change would be associated with self-criticism. In other words, we thought that people would feel better during pain, and the more self-critical our participants were, the better they would feel during pain. And so to test these questions, we did a few things. First, we brought just about 100 people who engaged in non-suicidal self-injury in the past year into our lab, and we tried to put them in a bad mood by using what we call a negative mood induction. And the reason we did this is because we know by talking to people that they're not engaging in these behaviors when they're feeling good or even neutral. They're engaging in the behaviors when they're feeling bad. So that was step one. After that, we had all participants do one of 3 tasks. They either did a distraction task, a pain task, or a time task. And I'll tell you a little bit about these in turn. So for our distraction task, we had all participants listen to a whole set of neutral words. And these were words that have been rated as neutral by about 1,000 people. And we had them write down these words as they were listening to them, either in all uppercase letters, all lowercase letters, or a mix of upper and lowercase letters. And the goal of this distraction wasn't to induce positive mood necessarily. It was ideally just to capture their attention. And that's why we were alternating the way in which they were writing down the words. Other participants did the pain task using what we call a pressure algometer, and there's one right over there. So as you can see from the picture, we asked participants to put the point of the algometer in between these 2 knuckles on their index finger. As soon as you place the algometer on the finger, you immediately feel pressure, and over time that pressure starts to feel pain. So we asked our participants to tell us when they felt pain, and then they could choose to terminate the task whenever they wanted to. It was completely up to them. Finally, remaining participants did what we called like the time task, in which they just sat in a room for the same amount of time as the other two groups. And it's as boring as it sounds, very boring. But regardless of condition, regardless of the task they were completing, all of the groups rated their mood before, during, and after. Because we really wanted to know how each of these tasks would be affecting their mood over time. So, looking at the results, this is a graph on the y-axis plotting their negative mood, and this would be an average rating of negative mood, either pre-task, during task, or post-task. And so what we found was that the distraction condition did result in significant reductions in negative mood, which is shown here. And all of these were gained after the task. However, neither the time nor the pain task resulted in changes in negative mood. So what I'm showing you so far is that distraction did result in small changes in mood, which is what we thought would happen, but pain didn't. And again, that's different from what we thought, which brings us to the second part of that second bullet there. So we thought that changes in mood during pain would be associated with levels of self-criticism, as I mentioned before. So now I'm going to show you a really similar graph, except this time we split participants into those who self-reported high and low self-criticism. And so what we found is that among those reporting low levels of self-criticism, participants felt worse during pain and better after the removal of pain. So this is supporting that pain offset relief model, right? They're feeling better once the pain is removed, but even a little bit worse during pain itself. In contrast, participants high on self-criticism actually reported feeling better during pain and about the same at the removal of pain. So in contrast to those with low self-criticism, who showed more of the pain offset relief benefits, the people high on self-criticism appeared to be improving through the experience of pain itself, which might be supporting that self-punishment model that I talked to you about before. So during the talk today, I first discussed reasons why non-suicidal self-injury might be related to suicide, focusing both on the fact that mental illness tends to be higher in people who engage in these behaviors, and on the possibility of conditioning. Second, I talked about why people engage in non-suicidal self-injury, specifically focusing on 3 models that explain why non-suicidal self-injury might help people to feel better. Thank you, and so next I'll take some questions, and then you'll hear from Erik.
So you talked a lot about the psychological side of it, but is there a kind of chemical component to self-injury and then feeling better, like a hormonal release or something that's connected to all of it?
So the question of whether or not there might be a hormonal component of why people would feel better after engaging in non-suicidal self-injury, is that right? Yeah. And so for a long time, people did think that that was the case. There are hypotheses about like the opioids and things like that, but if you actually look into the literature, that doesn't seem to be fully supported at this point. So there might be a hormonal component, but it's not entirely clear what that is right now.
Do you think people are less likely to commit suicide if they tell somebody about the things that are bothering them rather than keep them to themselves?
So the question was whether or not somebody might be less likely to take their life by suicide if they talk to somebody about the things bothering them than if they keep it to themselves. And I'm not sure if there is research on that. Do you guys know? I mean,
Don't they have guidance counselors
Yeah.
in high school?
so they do, yeah.
They
So
have guidance counselors in high school to talk to kids about their problems.
there definitely are, and the idea is that potentially social support, so even having somebody you could talk to, is thought to be protective, as in it might help decrease the likelihood that somebody will die by suicide. But the data on this topic are really, really limited, because I want to point out what Pete said before. Statistical methods are not great at predicting low base rate behaviors, so especially when it comes to protective factors like that, there's not concrete evidence. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So in light of what you and Pete both talked about, so since these like non-suicidal behaviors are able to basically by conditioning kind of predict whether or not somebody may be able to commit suicide, what type of interventions do you think both like communities and providers can make to like stop this earlier on?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So the question was whether or not there were some prevention methods that we could be employing earlier on, given that some amount of conditioning might be happening that predispose people to both non-suicidal and suicidal behaviors. And that's what a lot of the research that I've gotten to be a part of over the past few years has been working on. So it's specifically a treatment that's meant to make people feel more negative towards things like knives, blood, etc., and also to help them feel better about themselves. And we do have some preliminary evidence that it does work, but a lot more testing is needed before we were to roll that out and give it to people, because we don't want to do anything that could be harmful.
I have a question about the difference between compulsion and the cutting and hand pulling. Is it, which one, I mean, does it turn into a compulsion? And
So that's a great question. The question was the difference between compulsive behaviors like hair pulling and things like that versus what we call non-suicidal self-injury, which we don't necessarily consider compulsive. There do seem to be some differences in that compulsive behaviors are often done repeatedly, even in just one sitting, aren't necessarily as painful, and don't always turn into non-suicidal self-injury, and vice versa. So we tend to think of them as different because the prevalence rates are different, the things they're associated with are different, but they do have some things about them that make them seem similar as well.
So in some cases, have your studies shown that for non-suicidal self-harm that self-criticism, distraction, and
Pain offset relief?
Pain offset, that these three were factors, or was it always one or two, or?
Do you mean when asking people what their perception of it was, or what do you mean? Can you repeat
Or no,
that?
like just like the cause of non-suicidal.
Yeah. So the question was what causes people to engage in non-suicidal self-injury and whether it's distraction for pain offset relief or self-punishment.
Or like if all three can be put
Yeah.
together,
Or if all three can be together. I think that that's a great point. So this was one of the first studies to actually look at self-punishment and distraction in this population, but I think it's highly likely that these things are working together in interesting ways, and that's what I think that last graph might show. At different times when somebody's feeling more self-critical, they might get more mood improvement from pain, versus later on, if they were to start to feel better, they might get more mood improvement from the removal of pain, and in all cases, it could be somewhat distracting. I don't think it's just distraction alone for reasons that we can talk about after, but yeah. Yeah.
I apologize, this is going to be a long answer, but I was wondering about how dissociation and control factor in with self-harm behaviors, because I read literature that proposes both are a factor in behaviors.
I think that's a great question. So the question had to do with how much dissociation and control are related to people engaging in non-suicidal self-injury. And if you talk to people about the behaviors, many people report that they often use self-cutting or things like that when they're dissociating to bring them back into the moment. The degree to which we actually...
Dissociating?
So dissociation would be kind of like an out of your mind or out of body experience, feeling like you're not in the moment, kind of zoomed out, looking at yourself from a further perspective, or there are a few different ways to describe it, but that's probably one of the most common that I've heard. So self-harm could serve as a way to bring you back into the moment. But in terms of research on that, it's super limited because you can imagine we can't actually bring people into the lab and have them self-harm in the lab, and most people aren't dissociating when they're in the lab for a variety of reasons. So empirical evidence about that is very limited, if not non-existent, but it's a really interesting thought and one that we should try to find ways to study. Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry, just kidding.
How do you measure people feeling better?
Yeah.
Is that a brain measurement? Is that self-reporting?
That's a great question. So there are a few different ways to do it. In this study, we used self-report. Oh, sorry. The question was how we measured mood improvement in this study in particular. So in this study, we did use self-report of both negative and positive mood. I only showed negative mood because it's a lot simpler, but the positive mood results were similar. But you can also use what's called psychophysiological measures, meaning you could look at different movements in the face or yeah, things like that. I feel like that's the easiest. Or heart rate, yeah, thank you. But heart rate's not mood, that's arousal, also arousal. But for mood, it would be, yeah. There are other ways to do it as well. Sorry, that was a fail. But yes, there are a few other ways, and we use self-report. Words, thanks.
All right, we're going to have a 10-minute intermission right now.
Okay, thank you so much for being here. My name is Erik Nook. I'm a third-year graduate student in Harvard's clinical science program. I work in Leah Somerville's lab, and I'm very interested in how language and emotion interact, and you're going to hear about some of this work that I've been doing tonight, as well as some collaborative projects I've been doing with Franz, applying this work to the problem of suicide. So my job here tonight is to end with a little bit of a silver lining, a little ray of hope for the kinds of ways that we're thinking about how to potentially intervene to help people who are considering ending their lives or regulating their emotions through self-harmful behaviors, like some of those that Kathryn told you about. But before we jump into what I'm going to discuss, let me just refresh your memory of what you've already heard about tonight. So first of all, Pete introduced the idea that suicide and non-suicidal self-injury are immense personal and social problems, and that tackling these problems requires creative solutions on the part of scientists, policymakers, and community members. We also heard that non-suicidal self-injury is pervasive and a known risk factor for suicide, and something that might lead people to want to engage in this behavior, the kind of provocative, counterintuitive idea that Kathryn mentioned, is that non-suicidal self-injury might actually help people feel better. It might help them regulate their negative emotions. So what I want to talk to you about tonight is, first of all, a concept called cognitive reappraisal. Then I want to tell you about another concept called linguistic distancing. Then I want to tell you about how these two things relate to each other before applying them to the problem of suicide. And finally, I'll wrap up by just giving you a summary of what you've heard about tonight. But let's start with this concept of cognitive reappraisal. So can you tell me, by a show of hands, who here has ever been to see a therapist? Okay, that's excellent. This is a really exciting trend that I'm seeing. So if you have ever seen a therapist or spoken with a friend after a negative incident in your life, you've probably experienced cognitive reappraisal in the flesh. Basically, cognitive reappraisal is a therapeutic skill to help people feel better about bad things in their life or regulate negative emotions. And in layman's term, cognitive reappraisal is just changing what something means to you so that you feel better about it. Cognition refers to your thoughts, and reappraisal, an appraisal is the meaning that something has, and a reappraisal is changing the meaning of that thing. So cognitive reappraisal is rethinking the meaning of a situation in order for you to feel better about it. And just to make this crystal clear, I want to tell you about my friend Bob. Okay? So Bob is very excited to have a picnic with his friends in the Common this weekend, and so obviously when he finds out it's going to be pouring with rain, Bob feels a little sad. Fortunately, this is an excellent opportunity for Bob to go through this process of cognitive reappraisal, where he might think, actually, I recently bought a brand new tea kettle that I am so excited to share with my friends, and instead I'll just invite them over and we'll have a pot of tea together. And maybe that will make Bob feel a little bit better. So the same situation is happening in the world, but Bob changes what the situation means to him in order to regulate his emotions. This is something that therapists are helping their patients do all the time. But what's really interesting is that there are many different ways you can go about reappraising negative situations. And one that has been studied quite thoroughly is this idea of psychological distancing. In essence, people feel better about things when they're simply far away from them. But there's something interesting about psychological distance and how our mind represents distances in different domains. So let me explain what I mean by that. Here's a representation of a person, and things that are close to this person are in darker circles, and things that are far away are in lighter circles. And what's fascinating is that the mind collapses 3 different domains of distance onto a common neural and linguistic code. We even use the words close and far to describe distance on all 3 of these domains. For instance, the physical domain, the social domain, and the temporal domain. So to make this clear, we'd say that Boston is closer than Bangkok because they differ in physical difference from the here, where we're standing right now. We also say that our best friends are closer to us than our baristas. We use the same language, and in fact the same neural region computes differences on social domain of distance as we do for our physical domain of distance. And similarly, we say that tomorrow feels closer than December. So what's so amazing about the idea that our mind collapses these 3 domains onto a common code is that we can actually help people feel better about things by imagining them as far away on any of these domains. People feel better when things are happening farther away from them in space, in social perspective, or even a long time. So let me spell this out for you as well. Let's come back to Bob, and let's say Bob not only has a penchant for cozy time with his friends at home, but he also has an extreme spider phobia. Okay, so when Bob sees a spider like this really close to him, he gets really frightened. Okay. But what an excellent strategy that Bob can use, and something that people have studied before, is that when Bob is thinking about interacting with spiders, he'll feel better about this spider if he just imagines it as happening far away from him. Physically, he'll feel, if he imagines it as physically farther away, he feels better than if it's physically close to him. Similarly, Bob might feel very frightened if he imagines a spider head-on, looking at it through his own eyes. And interestingly, a strategy Bob can use to feel better about spiders is just to imagine this interaction from a third-person perspective. If he reflects on interacting with a spider, viewing himself in the room as a third-person observer, we know, both in terms of his self-report and also some of these psychophysiological reactions that Kathryn was talking about, his skin conductance, heart rate, even amygdala reactivity to this situation, will decrease if he sees it from a third-person perspective. So social distancing can help Bob feel better about this interaction. And finally, it should be fairly obvious that if we reflect on something happening right here, right now, Bob interacting with a spider in the room at the present moment, that's going to make him a lot more terrified than if he thinks about some situation that happened months or even years ago. So what I'm trying to explain right now is the idea that cognitive reappraisal is a strategy of thinking differently about things around you to make yourself feel better about it. And one strategy that we've studied is simply moving things away from you in space, time, and social distance. But now I want to tell you about a really curious phenomenon called linguistic distancing. So a number of researchers have begun to study how the words that people are using in their thoughts, in their speech, and in their written text are at any given moment capable of demonstrating whether someone is paying attention to what's going on right here and right now versus distancing away from what is going on right here and right now. How might we do that? Well, if we return to this concept of 3 different domains of psychological distance, we'll see that for 2 of these, there are grammatical categories that actually track distance along those domains. For instance, our use of first-person singular pronouns, words like I, me, mine, and my, track a greater focus on the closest social target, namely yourself. So people who are using these words more are very focused on themselves. They have very low social distancing. And if you eradicate these words from what you are saying and thinking and writing, you're actually forced to move away from yourself, therefore increasing your social distance. Likewise, verb tenses give us a hint as to whether people are talking about what's happening in the closest temporal target, namely the present moment, versus using present tense verbs, versus using past or future tense verbs, which means that people are distancing away from the temporal present. And what's curious is that people at text in any given moment, you can analyze what someone is thinking, writing, or saying. And there's a positive correlation between the extent to which people are using first-person singular pronouns and their use of present tense verbs. And this gave rise to the concept of linguistic distancing. People who are using both of these grammatical structures more are very locked into the here and now, and people who are using them less are distancing away from the here and now. And just to make this crystal clear, let me give you an example of something Bob might have told me in one of our sessions. So Bob said, "I can't stand this huge spider sitting on the table right in front of me. Its hairy legs look so gross. I really hope it doesn't jump on me. I bet its poison would hurt me." Now let me show you how this is a low distance comment that Bob just gave me. If I color code his first person singular pronouns in blue and his present tense verbs in green, you'll see that there's a lot of these grammatical constructs that track a low psychological distance focus. But if I encourage Bob to rephrase this statement and increase the psychological distance, he might do an excellent job if instead he says, "The huge spider sat on the table. Its hairy legs looked so gross. It may have been able to jump. Its poison may have been dangerous." Who thinks that this comment is a little less emotionally heated than the others? Great. So what Bob has successfully done is eradicate any use of first-person singular pronouns and transform his use of present tense verbs into past tense verbs. And as you all seem to ascertain, not only does this increase his psychological distance, it also seemed to make it seem like he was a little bit less negatively impacted by the spider. And this is a perfect segue into the next section that I want to talk to you about, which is how cognitive reappraisal, our ability to change what things mean so we feel better about them, and linguistic distancing might be intimately connected. So, just to make this clear, the question that I had in the next few studies that I'm going to talk to you about is, could shifting our language so that we move away from the here and now help us regulate emotions? And there are two ways that this could happen. The first is that merely distancing your language will in and of itself reduce negative affect. Just distancing your language might regulate your emotions. So how could I test this as a researcher? Well, what we did is we asked people to look at negative images and simply write about them. And then after each image, after writing about each image for 30 seconds, we asked them to rate how bad they felt about each of them. But what's critical is we changed how people were writing about these images across participants. So for one group of participants, they saw negative images, and for half of them, they wrote about the picture as if it was happening very physically close to them when they saw the word "here" above the image. And for the other half, they wrote about it as if it was happening physically far away from them when they saw the words "not here." Those are our physical distancing participants. Another group of participants, we had distanced socially. For half of them, we told them, use the word "I" when you write about this picture. For the other half, we told them, don't use the word "I" when you write about this picture. That was the only instruction that they got. We told them to stop using the first person singular pronoun of "I." And our idea was that this would force them to distance away from, again, the closest social target themselves. We're increasing their social distance. And finally, for the third group, you might expect what we're going to do. We asked them to write about half of the pictures using present tense verbs, and for the other half, stop using present tense verbs. And our thought here is that when people are forced to stop using present tense verbs and increase their use of past or future tense verbs, they'll distance away on the temporal domain. And our hypothesis was that people would feel better when they did any of these three kinds of linguistic distancing. So here I'm going to show you our results. Dark bars are averages of the trials when people are writing using close language, and lighter bars are trials when people are using more distanced language. Let me first talk to you about the physical distancing participants. So that we thought that the participants who were writing about things happening physically close to them would feel worse than the people who were writing about things physically far away. And that's what we found. People report feeling better, less negative, when they simply write about these images as if they're far away from them. Second, we thought that the same pattern would happen when we merely told people to stop using the word "I," versus when they were using the word "I." And fascinatingly, that's what we found. And finally, we thought that we might find a similar result when we asked people merely to stop using present tense verbs when writing about negative images. And once again, we found the same result. So these data from this study seem to suggest that merely shifting the words you use when you are talking about negative experiences, shifting them specifically so that you distance your experience away from the here and now, can make you feel better. So our first hypothesis was supported. It seems that distancing your language helps you feel better. But there might be a bidirectional relationship between these two concepts. It might also be the case that when we as therapists tell people, change how this makes you feel, change how this makes you feel, people spontaneously distance away from that experience in order to better reimagine and reconstrue and reappraise what the situation means. How might we test this hypothesis? Well, we ask people to write about negative images again, but now, instead of asking them to write and observing how they regulate, we tell them to regulate. So for half of the images, we tell them just respond naturally to this image, write whatever comes to your mind. And for the other half, we ask them to reinterpret the image to make themselves feel better about it. So participants for this condition could say, oh, I see some plastic bugs on a pizza, I feel fine about this, I'm still actually really hungry. And that's a reappraisal of the image rather than saying, this is a disgusting image, get it off my screen immediately. And as a manipulation check, just to make sure that we were getting good data, we wanted to first observe that people felt better after they had regulated their emotions, and that's indeed what we found. People reported feeling worse about images when they were told to respond naturally, and better when they had to change the meaning. But what we were really interested in was whether asking people to change their emotions, regulate their emotions, might also change the language that they're using as they're going through this process. So here I'm going to present to you a composite measure, something that incorporates both how much people are using first-person singular pronouns and present tense verbs. And I'll explain how these axes work. If you see lower bars, that means that people have less distance, okay? They're using more I and more present tense verbs. They're more locked into the present moment. If you see higher bars, that means that people are using their distance away from the present moment. They're using less first-person singular pronouns and less present tense verbs. And we found exactly what we were expecting. People who are regulating when people are regulating their emotions, they increase their psychological distance. We didn't tell them to change the words they were using at all, but they spontaneously reduced their use of the word I and reduced their use of present tense verbs. And in fact, people who did this more, which is this axis here, people who change their language more to be more distant are the people who do better at this task. People who are better at distancing their thoughts and feelings away from the present moment are people who are better at reinterpreting things to feel better about them. This seems to suggest that, again, there is a bidirectional relationship between linguistic distancing and emotion regulation. Here I showed you that just changing your words can make you feel better. And here what I'm showing you is that if you are trying to change your thoughts about something, getting some distance away from it can help you do that better. But to summarize this, let me give you another example back from Bob. So if Bob's in this situation where he's reflecting on how morose he is about his upcoming picnic that has been ruined, he might reinterpret the situation better if, rather than saying, I am so dismayed about this terrible thing that has happened to me, if he gets some distance and says to himself, wow, that storm was unexpected, he might actually be even better at coming up with an alternative solution. And now that I've described some of the work that I've done with Jessica Schleider and Leah Somerville, I want to tell you about just one more study where we connect the work that we've been doing on basic language and emotion regulation to the problem we've been talking about tonight, namely suicide and non-suicidal self-injury. And the question here is, could linguistic distancing help people regulate negative emotions without the need for self-injury or suicide? As both Pete and Kathryn have discussed, potentially self-injury and suicidal ideation are tools that people use in order to help them feel better about bad emotions. But maybe we could help people achieve that result in healthier ways. And to get an initial exploration into whether this might indeed be plausible, we wanted to assess the language that people use when they're talking about suicide and suicide-related thoughts and behaviors. Now, as Pete discussed, it's very difficult to study people who are acutely suicidal. But fortunately, there's this wonderful place called the internet, where you can observe people doing all sorts of things, including talking to each other. So this is a project that Pete led, and I was fortunate enough to be included on it. What Pete and our collaborators did is we went onto a website called teenhelp.org, and we we scraped the text that people were using to communicate with each other. And this website is a place where teenagers and adults go on to discuss a number of things that they are struggling with, including thoughts of ending their lives, non-suicidal self-injury, and other stressors that they're experiencing. And as you can see, we took almost 16,000 posts. So we have a large data set that we can use to see whether there's a relationship between linguistic distancing and some of these suicide-related behaviors. And we used a technique called a machine learning method, which basically uses a series of algorithms to detect whether certain words tend to appear with each other with certain amounts of consistency so that we can split the posts, these 16,000 posts, into 3 different groups without us needing to go through line by line and classifying them. And this is a collaboration we did with Karthik Dinakar at MIT. And very successfully, we were able to split these 16,000 posts into 3 different groups. One group in which people are discussing suicide and wanting to end their lives. Another group of posts in which people are talking about non-suicidal self-injury, hurting themselves without the intent to die, which is what Kathryn was talking about. And the third group, which we included as a control, which is something that both of my co-presenters have discussed with you, we wanted a group of posts where people are talking about things that are very stressful and difficult, but not related to suicide or self-harm. And these are people talking about conflicts with friends and family and things like that. So we analyzed these posts, just as I did for my other studies, to compute how much people are using language that is distanced away from the here and now versus very locked into the here and now. And I'm going to present this on the same axis I did before, so higher means more distanced. First of all, let me show you the difference between the people who are talking about suicide versus people who are talking about just negative things going on in their life. And this is where our hypotheses were supported. People are much more locked into the here and now when they're discussing ending their lives. This may suggest that people who are discussing suicide are so locked into their own experiences that they're having a difficult time reappraising what's going on around them, potentially helping people in this state to gain some distance through their words and thoughts might help them better regulate their negative emotions so that they don't feel compelled to end their lives. But interestingly, we found that people who were discussing harming themselves actually have very high linguistic distancing. These people are very good at distancing away from the here and now. And at first we scratched our heads about this problem, but eventually an interpretation that we're making, mostly informed by some of the work Kathryn presented, is potentially these people are distanced already because they've engaged in an emotion regulation strategy that is successful for them, namely self-harm or self-injury, non-suicidal self-injury. So these people are in need of extra remediation to help them gain some distance from their current experience because they've already undergone an emotion regulation strategy. However, that strategy may not be all that helpful for them. Nonetheless, this project provides initial evidence that linguistic distancing and cognitive reappraisal might be helpful in circumventing both of these negative emotion regulation strategies, namely suicidal ideation and non-suicidal self-injury. So we've told you a lot tonight, and I wanted to give you just the high-level bullet points of what each of us have presented so you know what to take home with you. First of all, suicide and self-injury are immense problems that require creative scientific solutions. Kathryn's work shows that non-suicidal self-injury might help regulate negative emotions. My work shows that we can be better at regulating our emotions if we use more distanced language. Pete's work shows that people who are talking about suicide have very low distance, and people who are talking about self-harm have very high distance. And all of us are using these insights to continue to study phenomena and work towards large-scale interventions that might reduce the burden of suicide and suicide-related thoughts and behaviors. And with that, I'd like to thank the large number of people who have contributed to our projects. We've discussed a number of studies, and here are all of the co-authors on these projects. We'd also like to thank the labs who have supported us in preparing for our presentations and our scientific endeavors. And lastly, I think we would all agree that our work would not be possible without an amazing team of research assistants helping out at each step of the way. And finally, thank you for being here and for your excellent questions.
How it differs in people who speak other languages and are multilingual?
That's an excellent question. So the question is about whether linguistic distancing can also be discovered in other languages. This is a question that out of 100% of my presentations I've now been asked. And I wish that I could direct you to excellent papers on it, but they haven't been written. And I think that's mostly because linguistic distancing is a very new construct in the field. There is some research on how language in general shapes our thoughts and behaviors. It's a large debate, and I think it depends a lot on what kind of psychological process you're talking about. For some, potentially there's very little influence of language. For some, there's potentially very large influence of language. But in general, concepts of time and the words that we use for time are actually related to some very interesting behaviors. And one paper comes to mind. German, for instance, and I don't speak German, but the paper informs me that there is less of a division between present and future in German compared to in English. And also there's a correlation between German and your ability to plan more into the future and save things into the future, such as your bank account, your savings account size, and how willing you are to sacrifice a small reward that you would get right now in order to get a bigger reward later on. So in that way, there is a relationship between the language that you speak and your approach to temporal, time-related phenomena, but how does that relate to linguistic distancing and things like that has not been studied. My prediction is that if you can find a way for people to distance using words, regardless of the language, you would get replication of each of these effects, but that's a totally empirical question that someone should study.
It seems clear that a lot of work is being done to try to figure out how to help people who are currently in the moment at risk of suicide, an acute condition. Is there some edging toward research that might tell us whether an at-risk quality for suicide, a proclivity, a tendency to suicide might be inborn, might be innate, might be in the DNA?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So the question is, are there potentially innate factors of certain people that predispose them to suicide? This is an excellent question, and I would love any input if you guys know more about this. We do know that there are genetic contributors to some forms of most forms of psychopathology. It varies depending on the disorder. We also know that you can trace certain brain volumes and brain functions and connect them somewhat to different forms of psychopathology. We also know that this is very messy business. Even predicting depression or schizophrenia is a guessing game. So predicting something like suicide is very difficult. Nonetheless, this is a central focus of research. I have a collaborator in my lab, Katie Inzel, who's looking at whether neural responses to rewards, getting little gains in short amounts of time, might vary between people who are contemplating suicide and people who are not contemplating suicide. There are people studying whether neural reactions to the desire to escape pain might differ in people who are contemplating suicide versus people who are not contemplating suicide. And I bring this up because it goes to show that, again, these studies haven't been written yet, so we're just trying to find them out now. But the best way forward is to use neural systems that we know a lot about to see whether there's kind of a hallmark difference in the people who are likely to to attempt suicide. If you're wondering about things even earlier, like genetics, that I also don't know of any really great solid research that has been done. And we also, in clinical science, are usually standing very strong on a diathesis stress model. So someone might have a weakness, a genetic weakness towards a certain issue and never develop that issue unless there's a certain stressor that comes along at the same time. Likewise, people can experience all sorts of stressors and maybe or maybe not develop a certain condition, but if you add the weakness in there, then it's more likely to happen. So there's always this nature-nurture combination that goes on.
So you talked about high distance in self-harm. Could that maybe have to do with like the out-of-body experience?
That's an excellent question. So the question is, is there a potential connection between high linguistic distancing and the people who are self-harming and how that relates to the previous question about dissociation. So this is an idea I hadn't had until tonight. I think it's an excellent insight and something that we should think a lot more about. My intuition is that the people on this platform are not dissociating as they're writing, but it is possible that something that underlies both the experience of self-harm and dissociation is this immediate transportation away from the here and now. What's interesting is that for some people, pain might actually help you bring yourself into the here and now, so there's kind of a puzzle to be figured out there.
Is it possible that rather than distancing yourself from a stressor, that gradually reintroducing it could also be a potential way of cognitive reappraisal?
So this is another excellent question. And just so you know why we keep repeating the questions, is so that people who aren't in the room can hear what you're saying. So the question is about, but what about actually approaching things that are really negative? Could that also help you feel better about them? This is an excellent, excellent question, and something that is a real puzzle for me in understanding my own data. We know that one of the most effective ways to help people overcome anxiety is to get them to approach the thing that they are really afraid of. We know that something that really predicts negative psychological outcomes is experiential avoidance, your desire to never feel bad things and push bad things away from you. So why is it the case that when we have people change their language so it's more distant, they actually feel better about things? Similarly, people with depression seem to always be in the past, and people with anxiety seem to always be in the future. So why are we telling them to move away from the present? So my thoughts on this are, I think there might be a difference between how your kind of prefrontal cortex cognitive mind deals with situations versus how your more kind of lower level mind needs to learn about things, all right? So if somebody is really afraid of spiders, the best treatment is not to get their prefrontal cortex to think differently about spiders. It's to teach their lower brain that spiders aren't as threatening as they think they might be. And that learning has nothing to do with running away from the spider. It has everything to do with getting very close to the spider. All right? So phobias and things like that that are enmeshed in a lower level of the brain that are not so wrapped up in a cognitive representation actually might be better treated by approach rather than by bringing things close rather than far away. That's my thought on that. It's an excellent point. My thought on people who are depressed and always seem in the past and people who are anxious and always seem in the future, why are we telling them to distance more? My thought there is that they aren't actually always in the past. It's that they're bringing the past into the present, or they're bringing the future into the present. And these things seem really distressing because they are very close in their mind. What we need these people to realize is that thing that hurt you, that happened a long time ago. Or this thing that you think is happening right now, you're losing your job right now, that's not happening. That's something that might happen in the future. So these people might seem hyper-distant, but actually they're not. This is an excellent question.
One more question.
Is this useful for like psychotherapy if you were to talk to somebody about a problem and say, don't use I, use she or third person?
This is another excellent question. So if I'm sitting with my patients, is it helpful for me to ask them to rephrase what they're saying using more distanced language? Will that help them? I want to say yes, and I have a little bit of evidence to back that up, okay? So one of the studies that has been run by Ethan Cross at University of Michigan asked people to prepare for a very stressful speech. But half of the people were told to prepare for it using the word I. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to say these things and I'm going to do great. The other half of the people were told to just use their name rather than the word I. Eric's going to go out there. Eric's going to say this. Eric's going to do great. And the second group felt a lot less anxious and they did a lot better. So there's a real behavioral consequence to shifting your language. Likewise, we know that shifting your language in general makes you feel better about things. So for both of these reasons, I would say that if therapists are sitting with patients, either instructing them to change their language, let's say this again in a more distanced way, or modeling distanced language. Oh, so it seemed you may have been feeling, rather than, oh, you are feeling. Both of these things might contribute to a shift in a cognitive style that will help people reinterpret what's going on. These are another excellent question. I have a bunch of transcriptions of therapy happening for randomized clinical trials with John Wise at Harvard. And I really want to analyze all the language data to see whether either of those predictions are true. But if anyone here is a therapist and wants to try it, let me know how it goes. Feel free to shoot me an email. But thank you so much for all the questions and for being here.